Let's look at the big questions for week 10, our examination of climate change and international organizations. So first off, we've got to ask ourselves, what is a tragedy of the commons and how does it apply to the issue of global climate change? What role does the UN play in setting global climate policy? And what international agreements are there that govern climate policy and how well do those international agreements actually work? We're going to start out this week by looking at the Oreskes article that I'd originally assigned during week 1 as an optional reading. So if you've already done it, great. This will be review, and if you haven't, that's fine. We'll take a look at it together now. So this article basically establishes that there is a consensus on climate change, that basically every scientist that studies this stuff agrees that climate change is real and that humans are causing it. So we can see then that this sort of is going to lay the groundwork for us for this unit on climate change. But it's also important to note that Oreskes cites several sources, but her first source, the first thing she says, this is why we should believe that climate change is real, is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. And this is actually an organization under the guise of the UN that provides scientific evidence on climate change and research into environmental science for the UN and for other countries. So it's this scientific research body, basically, that is set up at an international, intergovernmental scale. So all these governments can sort of contribute and get research out of there. So that is sort of our introduction into climate change as an international issue. And before we look at that further, we're actually going to pivot a little and look at 2 videos from the National Science Foundation that discuss the tragedy of the commons. Tragedy of the commons is a theory originally advanced by Garrett Hardin that basically says a common good or common pool resource is something that we can access, that we have unlimited access to, but that is scarce in some way. Basically what that means is we can deplete the resource. In economic terms, we sometimes call this rival or subtractable, meaning that my enjoyment of the resource or my use of the resource may ultimately stop you from being able to use it. So we can see this in the videos applied to grazing rights. And the videos then, the first video just sets up this problem. The second video then says, well, how can we solve it? It suggests 3 different ways, basically, that the government can intervene and help solve the problem. So this problem then applies to our issue this week of climate change, in that we can look at this on an individual scale and think of our actions in the world and look at, as the video suggests, right, it looks at sort of individuals and individual grazing rights, a farmer grazing cattle. Well, so we can look at ourselves as individuals and see how we use this common good of the climate. And you'll notice that there's not a huge incentive necessarily to reduce our individual carbon footprint. And if we start to think about it and think, well, are other people going to reduce their carbon footprints? Why should I give up my car and start bicycling to work if no one else is going to do it? That doesn't seem like a particularly rational decision. Remember, we're using rational in the economic sense of rational meaning maximizing our utility. So getting the most out of something. So you could say that it's not rational to reduce our individual carbon footprint if no one else is going to do it. And ultimately, this sort of costless consumption of the climate might lead to its ruination, might lead to this tragedy of the commons. But the government might be able to step in and do things like encourage clean energy use. We saw that last week when we looked at subsidies like for installing solar panels at your home. We also saw this looking back at our unit on plastics, right? Our lesson on plastics. The government has been working to reduce plastics by, say, banning microbeads, right? Which can help with the environment. Maybe that's probably not the best example for climate change, but you see what I'm getting at. The government can start to add incentives or regulations to stop us from abusing the climate. Now, this only gets us so far, though. We really have to zoom out and look at this on an international level. And we can think about this instead of individuals, think about it as individual countries, whole nations. And we can apply the same logic. Why would one nation reduce their carbon footprint dramatically if doing so might cost them money and effort and be just a difficult thing to do if other nations aren't going to follow suit? Because remember, we saw last week that the electrical grid's going to need to be upgraded in order to support more use of clean energy at a national level. We also saw that there's some incentives for governments to stockpile petroleum, right? The Strategic Petroleum Reserve, we saw that that could make a lot of sense to have. And energy security, we reasoned, might be essential for national security. And some of that might involve implementing clean energy, but it might also involve using dirtier energy sources, as we saw with China relying more on coal, even as they increase their clean energy portfolio. So we can see that individual nations might not have a huge incentive to act individually to combat climate change. But that could lead to a tragedy of the commons, where each nation in its own self-interest sort of keeps polluting, keeps increasing its carbon footprint, and ultimately leads to this ruination of the global climate. So if we don't have a government to step in to regulate individual action, right? We don't have a government to step in to regulate individual governments, or do we? We do, kind of. The UN. Now, the UN doesn't have quite the same amount of power over individual nations as our government has over us as individuals, but it still has some. And that's what we're going to be focusing on for the rest of today. We're going to be looking at excerpts from a textbook written by Cornell and other authors, which talk about this very issue. This idea that climate change is a tragedy of the commons and a global issue that needs to be dealt with this international policy. But this textbook takes an interesting sort of slant on it because it's an American government textbook, actually. So what it's going to do is it's going to focus on the role that the US plays in this global effort. And it's going to look a lot at the domestic politics around two global agreements, the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement, and how domestic politics in the US actually shaped the US's involvement in these global agreements, and perhaps ultimately what agreements got sort of hashed out at an international level. Now, after you look at that and sort of keep it in the back of your mind that we're also going to be looking at this interplay between domestic politics and international politics next week, we have an article or video straight from the UN. If you go to the link, you'll see there's an article and a video at the top. You're welcome to do one or the other. They're not exactly the same, but they get to the same issue. And these are somewhat technical, but they get into some of the nitty-gritty very briefly about the Paris Agreement. So that's going to introduce you to this big agreement straight from the horse's mouth, so to speak, right? This is an agreement under the UN, so the UN's going to tell you about it. And next, you have an article from the Council on Foreign Relations. And this is another one of their backgrounder articles. And what it does is, instead of getting into discussions of dirty energy or the SPR, it's going to look at global climate agreements. And it starts out by discussing several key climate agreements, including the Montreal Protocol. And this was not actually specifically about the climate. It was about originally CFCs, which were depleting the ozone layer. And obviously that very much relates to climate change, but it was not directly about that. And this protocol worked. It dramatically reduced global use of CFCs and helped allow the ozone layer to actually be restored. So this was a highly successful agreement, and it served as the model for some of our later climate agreements, including the UN, which I shouldn't say this didn't the next one wasn't modeled on this, but it set the groundwork for the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which created these annual Conference of Party, or COP meetings. And those offer a global forum for leaders from different nations to get together and work through climate agreements. And from those, we've seen things like the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement emerge. And the Paris Agreement we'll talk about more. We've already learned a bit about it, and we'll talk about that more again next week when we look at the domestic politics of Trump and Biden's roles in sort of more recent developments with the Paris Agreement. Now, this article also discusses a couple more things, discusses the sort of consensus on the science. You can skip that. We've already looked at it with the Oreskes article. It discusses the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal. That's an important goal, but for our purposes, it's not as critical, so you can just sort of skim through that. And then it discusses which countries are sort of responsible for global climate change. And that's going to be very important, and it's going to help supplement some of the Cornell reading, because the Cornell et al. Reading, you'll notice, has this infographic on national carbon footprints. But that's a sort of moment in time, right? It looks at them from just a single year. Whereas this article from the Council on Foreign Relations is giving us a sort of over time view of carbon footprints. These biggest polluters throughout the sort of industrial age. It's going to give us a different perspective on this issue. And then finally, you'll see a section on commitments that countries have made under the Paris Agreements, and then a section with alternatives to the Paris Agreement. And you'll notice at the end, there is a call for more comprehensive governmental action. So it basically says that governments may need to step in and do more than they're doing right now. But this is probably going to have to be done at a government level, not at an individual level or even at an industry level, which are some of the suggested alternatives that they mention. Now, finally, we have an article about COP28, because that conference, the Conference of Parties, COP28, is coming up really soon. And I've given you an article from CNET, which is going to tell us what to expect from the conference, as well as some of the controversies surrounding it. For example, where the conference is being held, who the president of the conference is going to be, and some sort of ongoing controversies about things like how the parties actually get to the conference. Well, they're all flying internationally, aren't they? That makes a huge carbon footprint. So is the carbon footprint of the COP conferences kind of maybe outsized, considering they're going to be talking about reducing national carbon footprints? So you'll get an introduction to that conference that's coming up and these sort of controversies surrounding it. Key takeaways for this week are that global climate change is a problem that needs to be solved on a global scale. That means, though, that we have to get many countries to cooperate, which can be really difficult. And without global cooperation, we might face a tragedy of the commons. International agreements have had mixed degrees of success, but they can work. And we are seeing more cooperation internationally and more focused interest on reducing global carbon emissions.